Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the life of one of the utterly fascinating figures to ever walk the earth, Napoleon Bonaparte. With Ridley Scott's epic film recently putting him right back in the global spotlight, well, we thought there's really no better time to figure out exactly who he was. Not the Hollywood version, but the actual man based purely on historical facts. We're going to dig through the records and separate the myth from the reality.
So, hero of the masses or the vilest of villains? Let's tackle this core question right out of the gate, because history is completely divided on this guy. I mean, on one hand, you have people who absolutely praise his strategic military genius and credit him with practically modernizing Europe. But on the other hand, his critics point to this deadly, insatiable hunger for power that literally cost millions of lives. We're going to look at the data and the events impartially to understand exactly how he achieved such mind-boggling power.
To do that, here's our chronological roadmap for This Explainer. First, the Corsican outsider. Then, his rise during the revolution, propaganda in Egypt, seizing the throne, the dual legacy, and finally, the final downfall.
Part 1. The Corsican outsider. Let's start with a really surprising geographic twist about the Emperor of France.
Napoleon wasn't actually born in mainland France at all. He was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, literally just 1 year after the Republic of Genoa sold it to the French to pay off some war debts. Growing up, young Napoleon idolized Corsican freedom fighters. He actually saw the French as colonizers. So you can imagine how much he resented his own father, Carlo. Carlo was a local lawyer who completely flipped his allegiance to the new French rulers just to secure a fancy noble title in 1777. Napoleon basically saw his dad as a total sellout. But, ironically enough, it was exactly those new French connections that landed Napoleon a scholarship to a prestigious military college in France. He was a total outsider there, ridiculed for his accent, which basically drove him to isolate himself and obsessively study history and military tactics.
Moving right along to Part 2, Rise during the Revolution.
Everything shifts in 1789. The French Revolution kicks off, it's incredibly bloody, it's chaotic, and Napoleon's family actually ends up exiled from Corsica to the mainland. But this chaos, it was a massive opportunity for him. In 1793, at a naval base called Toulon, there's this huge uprising backed by the British. Napoleon is just 24 years old, serving as an artillery commander, and he pitches this brilliantly aggressive strategy to capture a fort overlooking the harbor to just dominate the British ships. He fights with crazy bravery, takes some serious injuries, but it works flawlessly. This stunning victory earns him a promotion to brigadier general right then and there. General Dugumer was absolutely blown away, basically saying he didn't even have the words to describe Bonaparte's sheer genius and gallantry.
And his tactical dominance only grew from there. Just 2 years later, in 1795, he's tasked with crushing another massive uprising right in the streets of Paris. He was facing a staggering 1-6 numerical disadvantage. 1-6! But he didn't even blink. He rapidly deployed 40 cannons and violently suppressed the whole thing in just 2 hours. This swift, brutal victory cemented him as a national hero and made him a full general of the French army by age 27.
Part 3. Propaganda in Egypt. Because, as it turns out, military victories alone weren't going to satisfy him.
He realized he needed to weaponize information. In 1798, to mess with Britain's trade routes to India, Napoleon launches a massive campaign into Egypt. He brings 40,000 soldiers, but also, brilliantly, 160 scientists, scholars, and artists. Now, scientifically, this trip was a goldmine. They mapped out the topography, cataloged plants, and unearthed the Rosetta Stone, which, as we know, finally unlocked the translation of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. But strategically, it was a complete disaster. The British Navy completely wrecked his fleet at the Battle of the Nile, and by 1799, Napoleon actually secretly abandoned his own army and fled back to France.
But here is where it gets wild. He comes back, having lost his territories and abandoned his men, and he is welcomed as a conquering hero. How? Because he had built a PR machine. He controlled the newspapers and commissioned pure propaganda. Think about the famous story of him crossing the Alps in 1800. He ordered artists to paint him looking like Alexander the Great, charging up the mountains on a majestic rearing horse. The actual historical reality? He crossed the Alps a few days after his troops, riding a humble mule being led by a local farmer. But he carefully curated every bulletin and painting to make himself look absolutely invincible.
Which leads us perfectly into Part 4, Seizing the Throne.
Armed with this flawless public image, Napoleon returns to a France that's struggling with corruption and instability. So in November 1799, he orchestrates a coup and sets up a new government with himself as first consul. But he wants to keep the illusion of democracy alive, right? So they hold a public referendum to approve his new constitution. And the results, announced by his own brother, claimed that a laughable 99.9% of voters supported him.
But let's look at the actual historical truth hidden behind those cooked numbers. Historians like Claude Langlois have revealed that this referendum was a massive, calculated fraud. Out of the roughly 1.5 million actual votes cast, only about 50% genuinely supported him. The rest of the numbers were completely fabricated out of thin air to project unanimous support.
And he aggressively leaned right into this dictatorship. He faked another referendum in 1802 to become consul for life, and then in 1804 he went all the way and officially crowned himself Emperor of France. He wasn't even trying to hide his greed for authority anymore. He shamelessly admitted, quote, "Power is my mistress. I have worked too hard at her conquest to allow anyone to take her away from me."
Part 5. The Dual Legacy. This is where evaluating Napoleon gets really complicated.
You see, Europe at the time was deeply fractured. Left-wing revolutionaries wanted equality, while right-wing monarchs wanted to keep royal bloodlines in charge. When Napoleon marched across Europe, lots of people hailed him as a liberator. The poet Ugo Foscolo, and even Beethoven, who initially named a whole symphony after him, cheered Napoleon on for crushing oppressive Austrian and Prussian monarchies. But at the exact same time, he was actively betraying those core revolutionary ideals. He crushed free speech. He rolled back women's rights. In 1802, he shockingly reinstated slavery in French colonies. And instead of setting up actual democracies, he just took his own brothers, like Joseph and Louis, and installed them as puppet kings in conquered places like Spain and Holland.
Yet, despite being a tyrant, we have to acknowledge that he was an absolutely brilliant administrator who laid the groundwork for modern Europe. He rolled out the Napoleonic Code in 1804, which completely revolutionized the legal system. He effectively ended feudalism, enforced equality under the law for men, and pushed secularism to reduce the church's political grip. He stabilized a crashing economy by creating the Bank of France, modernized the tax system so the wealthy nobles finally had to pay up, overhauled public schools, and even built the infrastructure, like canals and water fountains, that forever modernized the city of Paris.
And that brings us to our final chapter. Part 6. The Final Downfall.
Ultimately, you just can't conquer the entire continent without facing a massive backlash. The turning point hit in 1812. To enforce a blockade against Britain, Napoleon makes the fatal decision to invade Russia. But the Russians are smart. They use a scorched earth tactic. They simply retreat and burn their own cities to the ground, including Moscow, leaving absolutely nothing for the French troops to eat or shelter in. Starving and freezing, Napoleon's Grand Army undergoes a catastrophic retreat. Smelling blood in the water, a massive coalition of European nations, Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, finally team up and break his army at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. He's exiled to Elba. Incredibly, he manages to escape in 1815, marches straight back into Paris, reclaims power for about 3 months, before facing his legendary final defeat at Waterloo. After that, he was permanently banished to the remote island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821.
So, wrapping up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought. You've seen the masterful propaganda. You've seen the genius administrative reforms that literally shaped modern civil law. And you've seen the devastating reality of a dictator whose relentless thirst for conquest cost millions of human lives. When you weigh the brilliant liberation against the bloody dictatorship, what's your verdict? Was he a hero, a villain, or something far more complex? Let that sink in and keep questioning history.